This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ or sign up for our email list to stay up to date on everything we have going on. And to get the most involved, join our free Mighty Networks community to get connected with others living this restorative justice life all over the world. As far as this podcast goes, make sure you're subscribed, leave a rating and review, and share with a friend to help us further amplify this work. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Dorothy, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I'm Dorothy Burge. I am born and raised in the city of Chicago from a family that originated in the South. My mother, father, grandparents, great-grandparents were in Meridian, Mississippi. And I am a mother. I am an activist. I am an artist. And I'm just a regular person.
Who are you?
Who am I? I am someone who believes that you should fight for what you believe is right. I am someone who believes that we as African people should be treated equally.
Who are you?
I am a mother. I am a mother of a 31-year-old young activist who went to Clark Atlanta University and has a degree in criminal justice. I am an aunt to a number of nieces and nephews, all who are just really incredible, nice people. And the great nieces and great nephews have become people that I am using in my social justice art works. Because, as my daughter says, they think I'm one of them.
Who are you?
I am, in many places, Mama Dorothy, especially when I am kind of in my activist role, because I've been doing this work for so long. It is something that I have done for years and something that has made a huge impact on my life.
Who are you?
Someone who taught for 26 years on a human rights and social justice program. And after 26 years, retired from teaching and still have contact with a number of incredible young people who were my students, who are doing incredible work all around the country.
Who are you?
I am someone who got trained in restorative justice. I'm also an anti-racism trainer. And so I use anti-racism philosophies in my restorative justice work.
Yes, beautiful. Well, Dorothy, we're going to get into the intersections of many of those things in just a moment.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Dorothy Burge to the podcast. Dorothy is an artist, quilter, activist, and restorative justice practitioner based in Chicago. Among so many other things, Dorothy has received a 2017 Robert Rauschenberg Foundation Artist as an activist fellowship, as well as being an Envisioning Justice Commissioned Artist. This episode features really important dialogue on policing, artistry, and so much more. But before we get back into it, I have a really exciting announcement about our Mighty Networks platform. The first of our podcast supporter discussion group gatherings will be on Thursday, May 26th, 2022, from 4 to 5:30 p.m. Pacific Time. There you'll get to connect with us and others who listen and support this podcast to discuss key learnings and questions that came up for you. You can join this gathering and get other behind-the-scenes access by signing up through our Mighty Networks community. The link to all of that is going to be in the show notes. And without further ado, let's get back into it.
And welcome back. Thank you again, Dorothy, for being here. I'm very excited to be having this conversation. You and I got connected through the very first guest of this podcast, Cheryl Graves, back when I was still in Chicago. And I think we were doing some circle work with some of the students in your human rights course. And so it was it was just a great chance to connect, and we're having this conversation in some ways on the precipice of the upcoming NACRJ conference in Chicago, which you're going to be involved in. But before we get into all of those things, all of who you are, how you've been doing this work, it's good to check in. So to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question right now, how are you?
I guess my response would be, how are you? Because I'm doing well, and I am excited to hear that you are a new father. And so that gives me a great deal of joy.
Yeah. These episodes get released out of order, so I'm not exactly sure what all people who are listening to this right now have heard if they listen to every episode of this podcast. But being a couple weeks in, I am feeling fatigue, even though like right now you said like, oh, you look so energized. Like, yes, I'm caffeinated. I'm getting decent sleep. I was talking to some folks a couple weeks ago about how this whole process has been challenging, but also like so hopeful in so many ways. And with that hope comes a lot of heaviness. And so just like balancing the tension of, every day we're learning something new. Every day we're having a new experience. Every day we're preparing my son to take on the world in right now, like be able to stabilize your head ways, but also thinking longer term and broader about how do you build a world for justice and equity. And so when I get to that part, it gets heavy. And when I think about like the work that I do professionally here, it can be overwhelming, but trying to stay present, especially in conversations like this, which are so energizing and invigorating and bring me a lot of joy too. Thank you for checking in. You've been doing this work that we're broadly calling restorative justice for a long time, but even before you knew those words, this work was a part of you. So in your own words, how did it get started?
I think it really got started when I was in high school. Mm-hmm. So I in Bloom, which was a selective enrollment high school. And I grew up in high-rise public housing on the South Side. And when we got to Lindblom, the school then was, as you know, Chicago is very segregated. And so we had to cross the color line to get to Lindblom. The school was located on Walcott, and Ashland was the border where African Americans weren't supposed to cross. And so going to Lindblom and being with other students, and we wanted to have a assembly to honor Malcolm X, and the school refused to let us have that. And so we did a walkout. So I walked out of Lindblom Selective Enrollment School and then was barred from coming back to school. So I think that's one of my first activist experiences.
Yeah. What inspired you to take that kind of stand?
Well, I just thought that at the time in the 68, 69, there weren't a lot of people talking about Malcolm X. So Malcolm X wasn't really well known in the community, in any community. And so we felt that it was important for us to learn about our history and to celebrate our history. And Malcolm X was one of those people that we wanted to celebrate.
Yeah. What I know, for people who don't know the history of the riots after Dr. King passed on the west side of Chicago, I imagine the people who were running your high school at the time had a lot of that fear in mind. What were the conversations that you as students were having with them that were fruitless in many ways?
Well, we had a lot of conversations. So, as you talked about us uh, having riots after Martin Luther King was killed, I actually lived on 63rd in Indiana. The National Guard came into my neighborhood armed. Can you imagine what that would be like as a 13-year-old seeing armed National Guards patrolling up and down your streets? It was something that I will never forget. It was very traumatic to see soldiers with arms on the street and then going into a segregated community right after the riots in an area where we really were not welcome at the time. We later found out that it was also the place where the Nazi headquarters was.
That's a lot. And as Black students in a school that was not being supportive of your efforts at both educating yourselves, your peers, and celebrating, who you were. Like, what were the conversations that you were having or running up against with administrators? Because I imagine some of those things are still happening today.
Well, it was very interesting because after I was actually barred from school, we had to bring a parent up in order to re-enter the high school. And so my mother was working, and so she sent my brother. And this was an event that I will never forget. My brother had just returned home from Vietnam, and we went up to the school, and I had a white counselor who started lecturing about how I should have known better and how I should not have done this in the first place. And she went on, and then my brother exploded, and he said, I just got back from Vietnam fighting for other people's rights, and you trying to tell me that my sister doesn't have any rights in this country? At that point, because of the loudness of his voice and the anger that he had, she immediately signed the papers and admitted me back into the school.
A case of an angry Black man working out in this situation, and we know different ways that could have gone. You were able to continue there, but once you left high school, how did this way of being, this ethic for justice, this activism, intersect with your career path and, your artistry?
So going to University of Illinois at Chicago, I am the first African American and the first woman to get an industrial design degree, which is part of the arts program. And while at the University of Illinois, UIC, I had a work study job where I worked in the Black Studies department. And that was really, really incredible. So in my industrial design program, I was the only Black person and the only woman in almost all of my classes for 3 years. And so Black studies is what really kept me alive.
We got interrupted with some technical difficulties for a moment, but we were talking about how being the only Black person, the only woman in your industrial design course was such a difficult time and place to be in, and being a part of that work study program in the Black Studies department was life-giving for you. Did you want to continue?
Yes, and so I took courses and learned my history and was inspired by speakers who came to campus, including Kwame Ture, which is how I got involved in the All African People's Revolutionary Party. As a college student, worked to free Nelson Mandela, raised awareness. This is in the 60s, early 70s. And so I graduated from high school in 72. So from 72 to like 75, I was at UIC and doing work with other African-American students. And Kwame Ture really changed my life. I had not really learned about the philosophy of Pan-Africanism and how all African people on the planet were united and should stay united. and how we should fight for all righteous causes. And so that was something that philosophy stayed with me for the rest of my life. I continue to honor that philosophy that was taught by him.
Yeah. You shared just like the high level of Pan-Africanism. And for those that don't know, Kwame Ture, aka Stokely Carmichael, was somebody who is at the forefront of leading that from the US side. And, there were talks of, moving back to Africa, right? How did those ideas land for you, and how did you end up deciding that Chicago urban planning, this is where I'm going to continue to make this difference?
So after I got a higher paying job, as I told you, I was really poor and growing up in public housing, and there just wasn't a lot of money in my family. And so I took, instead of a work study job, a paid job at the university as a student, and went to work at the graduate school. And while at the graduate school, I said to someone who was on staff there, they said, "What are you going to do after you graduate?" And I said, "What I really would like to do is I'm going to take a year or two off so that I can get funds. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to get a degree in urban planning and policy, because I want to make a change in the neighborhoods where I'm living, where I'm a member." And this person pulled my records and contacted the urban planning department, where I received a full tuition waiver and went to work at the Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission for the 2 years that I was in graduate school.
Yeah, what was that work like in spaces that, again, predominantly male, predominantly white? What was that work like?
It was a very interesting work life. I also there, for example, one of the things that I actually got to work on was a model fair housing ordinance, something that we did not have. And so I contacted people from different cities, towns, township, and the 6 county areas of Illinois, where Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission is based, and would ask them about their housing practices. And that was really eye-opening for me to hear people say, "What do you mean fair housing? We don't have that. We don't need that here." And most of the times when that was being said, it was from very segregated communities that were almost predominantly white and very wealthy. And so they saw no need to have fair housing ordinances.
Yeah. What were those conversations like from your end in response?
Well, all I was supposed to do was ask the questions and write down the responses. But those responses really did impact me.
Yeah. And you didn't stay there long.
I stayed there for 2 years while I was in graduate school. It was part of my internship. And then I left.
Oh, yeah. So I was saying, you didn't stay there long term, right? But those things that have an impact on you. How did you continue your activism? Is a hard word to think about doing in a professional setting, but just being pro-Black, pro-African, pro-diaspora throughout the professional world in a time that I would say it's still not easy right now, but in a time that was maybe even more difficult. How did that continue to manifest for you?
So the first job that I got after graduating was at the Woodstock Institute. And the Woodstock Institute studied practices of redlining in Chicago. Mm-hmm. And so I stayed there for about 6 months. And then I left there and went to University of Illinois, the Voorhees Center for Neighborhood and Community Improvement. And while working there as a planner, I worked with a number of grassroots organizations developing community-based plans for the future. And so I worked in Bronzeville, and I worked in Inglewood, and I met really incredible people. it was because of that work that I then moved to Bronzeville when I had the opportunity.
Yeah, Bronzeville is a place that has become very, very special to you. It's a very, very special place in the context of Chicago, especially for the Black community. For those of you, for the people who don't have the context of what Bronzeville is, can you share?
So Bronzeville was originally called the Black Belt, and it is where African Americans lived when they first came to Chicago. And we were kind of pushed out of certain areas after the Chicago fire. And areas in Bronzeville were completely destroyed and rebuilt as part of the urban renewal process. And so the Lake Meadows Prairie Shores housing development was once the center of Bronzeville. The riots that happened in 1919 started in Bronzeville when a young African American boy actually swam across what was the dividing line in Lake Michigan, like there was really a dividing line there, and swam across it, and he was stoned to death. And that's what caused the riots of 1919. So Bronzeville has a really incredible history. Incredible people lived there. Nat King Cole, Sam Cooke, the woman from the Jeffersons, let's see, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Etta Moulton Barnett. Just really, really incredible people. And it was a place where the Black metropolis was. And so many African Americans owned businesses there. And it was a place where you did not have to leave to get anything that you needed. And then it fell into huge disrepair and because of disinvestment. And that disinvestment went on for a long time. It was the place in the year maybe 1990s where you had the largest concentration of middle-class African Americans and also the largest concentration of public housing in the country.
Yeah, it continues to be a place that is full of the culture in some ways, in other ways, gentrifying, right? And what's striking to me, for those of you who don't know Dorothy, is Dorothy knows so much about this neighborhood that wasn't shared there just now, but about the city of Chicago, and all that has happened in different pockets and different areas. Storytelling is such an important part of restorative justice and our efforts in this movement. And so when I think about you and your work, you've told these stories through lots of different ways. Some of it through art, some of it through your the classes that you eventually ended up teaching. How did this ethic of storytelling become a part of your work?
I grew up in a family where oral history was extremely important, and so using that technique, I think, is very, very powerful to have people tell their own stories. I think it's more powerful to hear from someone who's been impacted by a situation than to hear about it or to hear about it secondhand. And so my philosophy in terms of teaching was to take my students to areas of the city where they would not normally go, and to hear people tell the stories of those particular neighborhoods and what happened in those neighborhoods and what their vision for the future was in those neighborhoods. And when we came upon really hard issues where there was lots of conflict, it was also my perspective to let them hear from both sides and for then us to have discussions about what was said on both sides and for them to make their own decision about what they thought.
Yeah, is there I want to acknowledge that we jumped from like your career in like public urban planning to teaching, but we can stay here for a second. Is there an example of that is really present for you that comes to mind?
People come in to my classroom who are torture survivors, who were not believed, who did 20, 30 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit because they were tortured into false confessions. And some of these students did not believe this, thought they had really done it. And so then it was important for us to go and hear the police perspective of what happened. And what do you believe about police torture? What do you believe about police violence? What are your perspectives on this issue? And to hear it from a number of different police perspectives also. So I've also worked over the years with Howard Sappho from the African American Police League. I have facilitated retreats for African American police organizations. Positive Anti-Crime Thrust was very close friends with Pat Hill from the African American Police League. Vanessa Wesley, who was and is very, very active in Bridging the Divide. That's the name of the program that hopes to bridge the divide between communities of color and the police. So I've been active on both sides of this issue.
Acknowledging that people's stories are best heard from them. Can you talk about some of the responses that police officers, Black police officers, gave in response to these ideas of police torture, police violence, and how those were received by your students?
Well, they were very honest about the fact that they were African American police. We talked about the fact that Renault Robinson, when he started the African American Police League, was given the duty of coming to the police station, being in uniform, and going out to guard the back of the police station. That was his duty. That is something that they assigned him to do for years as quote unquote punishment for him starting the African American. We also heard from Black police officers who said that in the time when the African American Police League was being formed and gaining strength, that one of the things that they would do is they would create these posters that they would put in African American communities, warning African American residents about which police officers were dangerous. And so for students to hear those stories, I think made a huge impact. We also went to police board hearings, and this is something that makes a huge impact. And one of the ones that I will never forget is Rekia Boyd. When Rekia Boyd was killed by an off-duty police officer who shot into a crowd of young people in a park because he said they were making too much noise, and he was not charged. And so the brother of Rekia Boyd went to the police board hearing that I had my students at. And he said, I'd like to know what you're going to do about the person who killed my sister. And the people on the police board just sat there and stared at him. And he said, I'm going to ask you again, what are you going to do about the policeman who killed my sister? And he broke down in tears, and as cold as ice, one of the members of the police board said, don't make us have to remove you. Your 2 minutes are up. That is not something that would have had the same impact if I had told the story and the students had not been there.
Yeah, this experiential learning ethic, seeing things firsthand, is a very different thing that many people experience in their education. We skipped the part where we gave people like the preview or like the overview of like what this program actually was, how you transitioned into it, and how you constructed it. So can you share with folks how that came to be?
So it was part of the Associated Colleges of the Midwest. It was started in the 1960s by Jody Cressman, who created the asset mapping model, and a number of other liberal leaning educators came together and created this program. Lou Palmer, who was a Black journalist, was also on the faculty of this program for a number of years. Salim Muwakil was also part of the program for a number of years. And so the goal of the program was to take students to different neighborhoods so that they could learn about the city of Chicago and so that they could learn about urban issues. And so I came in after the program had been well established, and I worked for the program for 26 years.
Yeah. What were some of, you talked, and we kind of skipped to the place where you were talking about some of the highlights of taking people across the city. What drew you there, and what are some of the ways that you left your mark on the program?
Well, one of the things that I was doing that I haven't talked about is after working for community-based organizations at UIC, I left there and went to the United Way of Chicago, where I worked as a consultant, helping people to start nonprofits, grassroots organizations to create nonprofits, and helping grassroots organizations to build the organizational structure so that they would be eligible for United Way funding. And so that was really an incredible experience that got me all over the city, got me to meet with incredible people who were doing incredible work all over the city. And it was just a really wonderful experience for me. And I learned a lot and met some really, really wonderful activists as part of the work that I was doing. That I wanted to do work that was related to what was really important to me in life. And so when I saw that people were actually doing really great work but couldn't get funding from foundations, that's when I decided that United Way would be a really good place for me. And I worked there as a consultant for about 5 or 6 years. And then I also worked in membership, where I reviewed people's applications for membership and recommended if they should get membership or not based on the requirements. Left United Way and then went to work for the Urban Studies program because the main reason that I went was because I had just become a mother, and at the associated colleges, I would have had the summers off. And to me, I was like, this is still good work, and it will give me the opportunity to spend more time with my daughter.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I value that now more than ever. Somewhere along the way, and I'm not sure where it was for you, you encountered the words restorative justice. When was that? And how has that impacted you since? How has that impacted your work?
Actually learned about restorative justice when I was teaching, and we were looking at different strategies for what is justice, and met with Cheryl Graves and Aura Shu, and we got trained by them. They were doing some incredible work, and started to put those restorative justice practices into my teaching practices so that I would have peace circles, restorative justice talking circles as part of the way that we processed the information that we were getting in different neighborhoods.
Yeah, what did that look like? What impact did that have on your students?
I think it was really, really important because one of the things that we did is that there were times when we actually got trained, the whole student body that I was teaching about in restorative justice practices, and then they were able to lead some of the discussions. So we would kind of do sessions where we would say, okay, you're going to lead the discussion next week. What is it that you want to talk about that we've discussed already? How is it that you want to lead this discussion? They would make their own centerpieces. They would bring their own talking pieces. It was really an incredible experience.
Yeah. Giving students I don't like using the word empower, but another word's not coming to me right now. So giving students the power to be co-creators of that space is so important, in allowing them to
and
take up. Go ahead.
It was very important, not just for them, but for me too, because I learned an incredible amount from them about what their lives were like and issues that were important to them. And so I think that's incredibly important.
Right. And again, it's through these stories that continue to be told in this circle process. Stories are both told orally and in other ways. One thing that we haven't touched on yet is your art. You are an artist. You make beautiful quilts. For those of you who are just listening to this, which is everybody, we're going to link Dorothy's website so you can take a look at some of the quilts that she's created. How did quilting become a hobby for you, if you will, but then also your form of activism?
So you should know I came from a long line of quilters. My mother quilted, my grandmother quilted, my great-grandmother quilted. And I knew both of my grandmothers and I knew my great-grandmother. So I feel very fortunate. They tried to teach me to quilt when I was young. I had no interest in quilting, thought it was for old people. And I was like, nope, not going to do that. So then I started going after my daughter was born. We started going to the African Festival of the Arts here in Chicago and had vendors who came from all over the world. So we had African vendors there, in addition to vendors from all over the country selling different products. And so I saw incredible artwork made from fabric that I could not afford to buy. So I went home and used my art design skills that I hadn't used in a long time because I was doing planning and started creating artwork for my home. And so I was doing this artwork for my home and got a call from the head of education at the DuSable Museum. And he said, we are doing
the DuSable Museum, for those who aren't Chicagoans, is
the African American History Museum. So DuSable is the first resident who was not Native American in Chicago. And that history was lost for a number of years. When I went to school, we were taught that it was Kinsey, who was a white man, and not DuSable, who was a Black man who was married to a Potawatomi woman. And so all of that history is really, really important. So I got the call from the DuSable Museum, and they said, my daughter, who was an activist very early on, was a docent at DuSable Museum in 7th and 8th grade. She was taught how to give tours of the DuSable Museum, and she was often called when they were having young people come to the museum because they wanted a young person to lead the tour. So she was talking about and showing them some of the art in the house. And so they called me and said, we're doing an exhibition called Citizens Picnic, and it is about lynching in America. Would you be willing to make some pieces to go into this exhibition? And so I created 2 quilted pieces One was a quilt on Ida B. Wells Barnett, who fought lynching, and one was James Cameron, who is the survivor of a lynching that happened in Marion, Indiana. So I think it's also important to let people know that all of the lynchings did not occur in the South, but there were lynchings all over the country. And I think that that's one thing that I would like to raise the Equal Justice Initiative up and just really encourage people to go to the Lynching Museum in Alabama. It is incredible. So I actually created these two quilts that were in the exhibition. And then I continued to do just quilts for my home. And then Trayvon Martin was killed. And when Trayvon Martin was killed, I made a quilt that I took to protest that I used instead of a sign or a banner. And it was during this time that I met a woman named Dr. Carolyn Maslumi, who is the founder of the Women of Color Quilters Network. And Dr. Maslumi created this exhibition that on Obama after he had been elected, and that exhibition was being held at the DuSable Museum. I went there and I asked her, do you ever take quilts from people who are not members of the Women of Color Quilters Network? And she said, show me what you have. So you all should know I'm not tech savvy. So I tried to pull it up on my phone and was unsuccessful. I had photos of it. And then she gave me her card and said, if you want to, you can send me the quilt. I'll look at it and let you know what I think. So I took that opportunity to go home and put together every quilt I had ever done in a box, shipped it to her, and she called me and she critiqued each quilt. And she said, your subject matter is really good and really powerful, but your quilting sucks. So you learn how to become a quilter. So that's when I started joining quilting guilds and learning to quilt and not being a self-taught quilter.
Yeah. What has that journey been like to, up your quilting game?
It's been very interesting, and it's been sometimes it is very stressful. When you are doing quilts that I have to do quilts that mean something to me. Mm-hmm. And so I have done quilts about George Floyd. I have done quilts about Centoya Brown, issues that really impact me, life without possibility of parole, the fact that we have a serial killer here in Chicago who is killing African-American women and people don't know about it. I think quilts now have become a way for me to educate and raise consciousness about issues that are impacting me and other African Americans in this country.
Yeah, I really want to invite folks to follow the link that's in the show notes I'm going to leave it on the portfolio page of Dorothy's website and just take a look at a lot of the work. And, from my my non-observant quilter eye, like, these are beautiful, these are wonderful. They do not in any way, shape, or form suck.
That's because you've seen the ones after I learned to quilt.
Well, I mean, the lessons have been working.
I had to redo the Trayvon Martin one because in order to get it into quilting exhibitions and quilting shows, it had to be quilted in a different way. And so I had to learn to do that and quilt it in a way that it could be respected as a quilt and also for the social justice issues. The Women of Color Quilters Network, we do a number of quilting exhibitions about social justice issues. So there is one exhibition that we did where we quilted from 1619 to 2012. So different quilters took different years, different decades, and created quilts about issues that were impacting the African American community during those times.
Are those publicly available to look at on the internet?
Yes, they are. And it's the Women of Color Quilters Network, and it's Dr. Carolyn Rumi. And you will be blown away by the artwork of some of the quilters. Bisa Butler, who a number of people know now because she has gotten so much incredible attention. She's incredibly talented. She is also a member of the Women of Color Quilters Network.
Yeah, I'm just looking at this now, and I'm also going to link this in the show notes for people because these are some really fabulous quilts about, our history.
Yes, and so 1619 started with a woman by the name of Carolyn Crump, another incredible artist, and her quilt was about the people who came over on the first ship. And the ship is actually made, you wouldn't know it until you got up close to it, but the ship in her quilt is actually made by Africans intertwined to create the boat. It's really a powerful, powerful piece of art.
Yeah. Sorry, I should be fully paying attention to you, but I'm scrolling through this page of quilts that they're so beautiful. And I'm not sure if this page that I'm on, where it's yours for race and country.
Yes, that one is about Charles Young, who was the third African American to graduate from West Point. He was a Buffalo soldier.
Gotcha. Okay.
And he taught at military academies for a number of years. And so that was an exhibition that we did to honor Charles Young and his legacy.
Absolutely.
So done quilts to honor Nelson Mandela. So if there are issues out here that we want to talk about, those are the quilts that we actually create. And that is what really keeps me inspired to do my quilting is if there's an issue, I feel quilts are a way to not only document history, raise awareness about what's happening now, but I also believe that the quilts actually push people into action. And I think that's important too. People will often come to quilt shows just to see quilts. And when they get there, they find out what's happening in different communities, and that pushes them to find out more about what the quilts are about and then what they can do about the issues that they've learned about.
Yeah, absolutely. I know this is making for like a horrible like audio story, like where I'm just like blown away by like all of the artistry that's on display. And so we'll definitely link the Women of Color Quilters Network on here in the show notes as well, so people can take a look and learn and be inspired to action. You're continuing to do this quilting work. You're continuing to do this storytelling work. One of the ways that that's going to manifest is at the NACRJ conference coming up July 7 through 9 in Chicago. But you're actually doing a session on one of the pre-conference days, July 6. Can you tell us about what's going on there?
Well, I'm going to be doing a workshop where I have invited members who were tortured by Chicago police to come and tell their stories, and from people to interact with people who have been wrongfully incarcerated. I've also invited Ronaldo Hudson, who is someone who I fought to get off death row years ago when we had death row in Chicago, in Illinois. And he was on death row because as a young person, he had a very traumatic childhood. He had a twin brother who was pushed down and killed, pushed down a flight of stairs and killed when he was like 8 years old. And he witnessed that. His mother and father were addicted to drugs. And so he went from house to house, living with different family members. And by the time he became a teenager, he was also addicted. And he went into a person's home and he killed that person during robbery. And he was sentenced to the death penalty. And so I fought for years to end the death penalty. There is an end to the death penalty. And one of the reasons that I fought to end the death penalty was because this is something that was being disproportionately applied to African Americans and other people of color. And so a white person could have committed the same crime with the same kind of background and gotten a different sentence. So Ronaldo is also out now. He is off. We got him off of death row. And then he was given life without possibility of parole. And after being a model prisoner for over 30 years, he was finally released. And so I just think it's important for people to hear people who committed crimes, changed their lives, and also people who were wrongfully convicted and who are trying to get that stain of the wrongful conviction out of their lives so that they can live again.
Yeah. For most of the people who are listening to this podcast, I imagine don't need to be convinced of the harm that the death penalty specifically causes and the criminal legal system in general causes disproportionately to people of the global majority, specifically Black people. But to hear these stories from folks who have been directly impacted, not just the people, the educators, the activists, community folks who are doing work to dismantle those systems and change those systems, hearing it direct from people is so important. Go ahead.
I also want to say that Chicago is the first city in this country to give reparations to African Americans, and those reparations were given to police torture survivors, the torture survivors of a police commander by the name of John Burge. And no, we are not. And so I said to people who try to use that as a way to shut me up, are you sure you're not related to John Burge? I now have a response to that, and that is that, yes, we are related. His people owned my people. So, yeah, after I say that, people stop asking me about the relationship between the two of us. So, but John Burge tortured over 141 African-American men and women from 1972 to 1991. And so I got involved in the movement to get him fired in the 90s. And it was led by Standish Willis, who was an incredible attorney, who is now retired. And he had an organization called the Committee to Free Aaron Patterson and Mumia. And we got Aaron Patterson off of death row. After that happened, we then changed to Blacks Against Police Torture, an organization that still exists. So, reparations ordinance to me, I testified in favor, in support of the reparations ordinance. And one of the things that I said, which was really important to me, is that the reparations ordinance to me was restorative. It was not your typical way of looking at justice. What we wanted them to apologize for what they had done. And then these were strategies to help make the community whole. And the reparations ordinance was written by an attorney by the name of, from the People's Law Office. And she just was an incredible person. And I just think that, it was the right time, and it was something that really needed to be done. But I also want to say that I do not believe that we would have gotten the reparations ordinance passed, which was written by Joey Mogul, if we had not had the judge order Laquan McDonald's tape to be released. Because right after the tape was ordered to be released, was when the mayor said, I'm going to support the reparations ordinance.
Yeah, some real cover your ass shit by Rahm Emanuel. We don't have to go into all of that, but thank you so much for giving the context. This reparations order, it wasn't just money to survivors. It was about transforming and preventing the way, preventing some of these things from happening again. So, what were some of the other things that were included?
Well, first of all, the city had to issue a public apology. The second thing is they agreed to teach about the torture that happened in Chicago in 8th and 10th grades. We're still fighting to make sure that happens. They were promised a public memorial to honor the people who had been tortured by police under the command of John Burge. We're still fighting for that memorial to be built. A Chicago Torture Justice Center, which does exist, where people who have been tortured by the police can go and receive counseling, support, guidance on employment, housing, any needs that they might have. And so those are some of the components of the reparations ordinance that I feel are really very restorative. Each survivor was given $100,000, and we know that that is not a lot of money, especially when you have spent 10, 20, 30 years of your life in prison for a crime you didn't commit. So, but those are some of the components of the restorative justice. I'm sorry, I keep calling it the restorative justice.
Reparations. Yeah. People can look up more about all these projects. But I do think it's a really good demonstration of, restorative justice is not just about the person who has been harmed and the person who has caused harm specifically, right? What are the community and institutional supports that can be leveraged to repair harm or make things as right as possible? John Burge is dead now, right? But what are the ways that, like, even without him still being alive, repairs be made? He never apologized. He never
admitted.
Yeah.
And after 141 people being tortured, many of them serving decades in prison, he was sentenced to 4.5 years only 4.5 years, not for the torture, but for lying about the torture. And he only served 3 years, and he got to keep his full pension. So that is when we really started looking into this is not justice. So what else can we do to get justice? And that's when the fight for reparations really started.
Yeah. And so for those who want to learn more, you can Google is also your best friend. There are lots of resources out there. But if you want to hear directly from some of the people who have been impacted by this, July 6th, one of the pre-conference sessions for the NACRJ conference is a space for you to go learn. Before we finish our conversation with the questions everyone answers, if you've appreciated what you've heard and want to learn more about restorative justice, we have so many ways to help you out. Most easily, you can join our Mighty Networks community and take our free mini course, Restorative Justice. What's that? To get a solid grounding in how we in the Amplify RJ community conceptualize this work and apply it to our lives. We also have a rotation of other live and asynchronous learning opportunities on the courses tabs of the Mighty Networks community to help you go deeper. Finally, if you want to get in touch about bringing this work to your school, community, or organization, email us at info@amplifyrj.com to make it happen. Now, back to the episode. I do want to transition to some of the questions that everybody answers when they come on this podcast. So, in your own words, define restorative justice.
To me, restorative justice is a way that you heal the harm that you have done. That's what restorative justice is. How do you restore people? How do you heal people to account for the damage and the hurt and the pain that you have actually caused?
Yeah. As you've been going about this work that I'm broadly going to call restorative justice, what's been an oh shit moment, and what did you learn from it?
Oh, I've had many of those. Oh, let me just tell you my first one. So, at my first restorative justice training, the first day I went in, they gave us this example where they said, a young man has been caught shoplifting from a store, and we don't want to use traditional methods. How would you use a non-traditional method to hold him accountable? And I said, I have to admit, I said this, I would make him a t-shirt, make him wear a t-shirt that says, I'm a thief. And I was like, as I look back on that now, I was like, how did you think that was restorative? So I've learned a lot about restorative justice. And there have been times when I was like, it's just a really incredible experience. Seeing some of the Burge survivors be trained in restorative justice has been really powerful for me.
That's more like of an shit than like
to hear their stories, to hear them with the philosophy of restorative justice is just really an incredible thing that I am very, very proud of.
Yeah, absolutely. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, dead or alive. Who are they, and what is the one question you ask the circle?
I guess what I would ask is, how do you heal the hurt? And I would ask Nelson Mandela that. I would ask Fannie Lou Hamer that. I would ask Ida B. Wells that, and Harriet Tubman that.
I'm going to put you in their company and ask you, how do you heal the hurt?
I don't know if the hurt can ever be healed. I look at a number of the Burge survivors and other survivors of police torture, and I see the trauma that they've come through. I see that they are incredible human beings who are doing incredible now, but the healing process is something that they're going through. We have at the Chicago Torture Justice Center an incredible psychologist who is an incredible therapist. And I think that is one way to start. I think telling the story, some people have said to me that telling their story is a way to heal. Other people have told me that telling their story is too traumatic, that they can't tell the story. That's painful. And to respect both of those perspectives, I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks different for everyone. I'm curious, we haven't talked about specific harms that you've encountered, and we don't have to, but, as you've experienced harm in your life, how have you healed?
You know what? I've used art a lot to heal. I think the trauma, I've experienced a lot of you grow up in a gang-infested community, and you see a lot of things happen to you and your family members. You see no accountability in terms of community safety. And then you see no accountability in terms of police. So you're kind of stuck in the middle. And so I have done my best to be restorative in any way that I can be. And I'll give you an example of something that happened recently. So I'm in my house, and the smell of marijuana is so strong that I can hardly breathe in my bedroom. And I go out, and there are people sitting on my porch, who I do not know, and there are probably 8 of them, smoking marijuana, young African-American men. And so I go outside and I say to them, just going to tell you what I said. I said, look, I'm old, and I don't believe in calling the police unless I have to. However, you all are smoking marijuana on my porch. I can barely breathe. I said, you all need to leave. The person who spoke first said, that's too bad, blah, 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 blah. And I said it again. I really do not want to call the police. I believe you all could go someplace else and smoke marijuana where it would not impact people in the way that it's impacting me. So I am saying to you again, I would like for you to leave this place and smoke your marijuana someplace else. And the guy got all huffy again. And then one young man said, man, shut up and let's go. And they all got up, and one of them said, thank you for not calling the police. We appreciate it. And I haven't had any more problems.
Yeah. Boundaries are important, right? Being restorative doesn't mean we let people... Being restorative doesn't mean being permissive, right? Asserting your boundaries. Go ahead.
I did not come to them with disrespect. I did not think that I should have received disrespect. And I was so happy that there was one young man there who was able to influence them all to be respectful to an elder. And I appreciated that.
Yeah. Just like the everyday ways that in interactions with people who, like, you don't have a relationship with them pre-existing, but, you were able to express your needs. They were, after the second time, responsive to that.
No harm. That's right.
No harm. Yeah. It does take bravery, courage to do that. But if people are checking Instagram, they can like timestamp when we're actually recording this conversation. But I posted today a Maya Angelou quote about how, courage is the most important virtue, because without courage, we can't uphold any of our other virtues. And so, thank you for having the courage to do that and share that story and all the other stories that you've shared on this podcast. We're almost done, but I have a couple more questions. There are hundreds of people, maybe thousands eventually, of people listening to this podcast right now. What is one thing you want them to know?
I want them to know that it is important for us to treat people with respect and for us to be treated with respect. That it is a two-way street. And I want people to know that intergenerational conversations are extremely important on both sides. I have so much from youth. I hope youth have learned from me. And it's been an incredible experience for me to interact with people of different generations from the time I was young to where I am now.
Absolutely. This one requires a little bit of homework on your part. Who's one person that I should have on this podcast? And just keep in mind, whoever you answer, you have to help me get them on here.
Okay. I would say, and I'm not sure which of the torture survivors that I would want you to have. Mm-hmm. I I really would like it if one of the torture survivors tortured by the police who are now doing restorative justice work could come and be on one of your podcasts, and I will reach out to them and see if we can make it happen.
Love it. Love it. Looking forward to it. And finally, how can people support you in your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
What I would like for people to do to support our work is, as the Women of Color Quilters Network members, I would like for them to kind of learn the history of quilting and how it's been used to pass stories, to document history, and to spur people to action. And I would like it if people see a quilt that is important to them, that they feel moves them to actually do something about the issue. And I'll give you an example. The quilt that I did on Trayvon Martin went to an exhibition in Texas, and I got an email from a woman who said that she took her son to the quilt exhibition because she loves quilts and she's a quilter. And her son was in a stroller, and she was saying to her son, "Oh, if you could only see these quilts." And he's like, 1 year old. If you could only see quilts, you would be so moved. And she said, then she got to my quilt, and she said it broke her down in tears. And she said, because as she was pushing her son, she realized that could have been her son, that Trayvon could have been her son. And so she came home, and she said it moved her so much that she looked for me on the internet, searching for me, and then reached out to say that this was a powerful quilt and that she appreciated the work that I was doing, and that how much it moved her and made her think about the fact that, yes, this could have been her son.
Yeah. It's your image of shame. And for folks who don't know what we're talking about, please use the links in the show notes to go visit both Dorothy's website and the Women of Color Quilting Network's website, so you can take a look at some of these. We'll also post some of them on our Instagram. The Trayvon quilt is one that I am most familiar with, and I think we'll post that on Instagram. But there's infinite ways to do justice work. The storytelling that you've invited people into, both through your quilting and the way that you've taught over the years, has been so impactful. Thank you so much for sharing your stories and the wisdom that comes with them over the last hour or so. Are there any other things that you want to leave the people with?
Just that I hope to see you all at the Restorative Justice Conference.
Yes. Link to get to that is also in the show notes. We'll be back with another conversation with someone living this restorative justice life next week. Thank you again, Dorothy, so much. Everyone else, take care.
Thank you so much for having me.
Elise here. Thank you so much, Dorothy, for all that you had to offer this episode. I thought it was amazing that Dorothy emphasized the importance of reparations. First off, what do reparations look like? And how can reparations be implemented beyond a monetary lens? I think Dorothy touched on the fact that reparations are both monetary and education-based. We must have better education about the rich histories of African American people in this country. We must emphasize the quotes, poetry, and artistry that is so key to helping restorative thinking thrive, and also honoring Black creativity by amplifying it is imperative to sharing and educating this message and to reparations. To push past performativity, we need to pair both monetary means and education in order to get true reparations. I also really appreciated that she brought up the point of policing. Dorothy talked a bit about policing and the gravity of calling the police on other people. I wanted to pose the question, what alternatives to policing can we offer, and how can we call upon those alternative methods instead of our broken policing system? If you want to share your thoughts and talk more about these questions, make sure to sign up for our Mighty Networks, which is shown in the show notes below, where we will be hosting our first podcast discussion session coming up on May 26th. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll talk to you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also stay connected with us by joining our Mighty Network community, following us on social media, getting on our email list, rocking our merch, signing up for a workshop, or inviting us to do work supporting your community. So many options! All the ways to get involved are in the show notes. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.